Okay, Jeff, what are the best shoes ever?
Vans, hands down. Everybody knows that.
Okay, every middle schooler knows that. Why? Because somebody told them, I don't know, they all wear them. They all think they're the best. Does it really matter?
No.
There are some ideas that really don't matter, but there's a lot of ideas that really do matter. Today, we're going to talk about how you can teach your students worldview, why it matters, and how they can use it for their everyday life.
Hey everybody, welcome to the 10th episode of the Ministry Coach Podcast. How exciting.
Oh, 10.
I didn't think we'd make it this far.
Really?
No. Yeah, I did.
But 10 doesn't feel very significant. I feel like if it were 100, we could celebrate, but 10 is like whatevs.
Yeah, but it was so hard getting you to start to do this that to me, 10 feels like 100.
What can I say? I have a lot of interests. I'm so glad that you convinced me to say yes, not only to marry you, but also...
And that took a lot of prodding.
But also to start the podcast because it's been really fun. And I feel like God has already really used it. And I feel like we're good together.
Let's get married again. Well, I hope you guys are getting a lot out of this too. So let's just go ahead and dive into what we have today.
Yeah. So we just celebrated our oldest daughter turned 7 on May 15th. I don't know when this is going to air, but May 15th, 2020. And, it's so funny because I remember when she was first born, like one of the biggest topics of conversation between us and really between my parents was her education. So education is a really, really big deal in my family. It sounds like it was in your family too.
Yeah, definitely.
Everyone's gone to college and some. And so it just started this conversation of private school, public school, homeschool, good reasons for all three. I know very great success stories for all three. There's good parts about all of it. But here's the bottom line for me, because
what it boils down
to, it wasn't so much about the behavior of the kids that I became concerned about. Like, I don't want my precious angel around naughty children. Right. Like that really wasn't my biggest concern. My biggest concern is something we're going to talk about today. And believe it or not, this conversation has a lot to do with youth ministry. I know we're getting all parental, and boring on you right now, but the whole weight of this education question for me was this question of worldview, because I knew no matter where she goes, she's going to be around kids that do bad things. Maybe she'll be the kid who does bad things,
I was the kid who did bad things. So why wouldn't she be?
I wasn't.
Yeah, right.
I was the kid who did good things.
Nope.
Yes, I was. I got one detention and it was because I was late, not because I was bad.
All right.
And I stood on red feet once for eating cup of noodles with my hands.
I don't know instead what you're talking about.
It's like a timeout. You had to stand on these feet that were red. I don't know. Anyways, I was a really good kid, but I knew there were kids around me that weren't, but it was like worldview. So no matter what was going on around me, kids doing bad things, me hypothetically doing bad things, but I wasn't. It was like, do you know the truth? And how does the truth interact with your behavior? And that was my big concern for our daughter. It was like, I want her to have the correct worldview calibrated in her heart and in her mind so that when she does confront the narrative of the culture and this very loud cultural voice that's telling her, well, by the time she's in junior high, who knows what the cultural narrative will be, that she'll be able to navigate that truth and be equipped for it because she has the truth already calibrated in her heart and mind. And so what we're going to talk about today is how we, as youth pastors, have this probably more now than ever, this huge weight on us to teach our students worldview. And by that, we mean we're not just teaching our students what to think, the style of youth ministry a lot of times becomes like a series of series. It's like, we're going to do one on relationships, and now we're going to do one on a book. So maybe we'll do Acts, and then we'll do one on guys and girls issues, and we'll split them up and we'll do a thing. And all that is fine. I have no issue with series. That's how I do my lessons all the time.
But it all should fall under the worldview of how you think, how your faith interacts with your life.
Right, because the worldview is like up here, and all those little questions are down here. So if you have a correct worldview, it's under the umbrella of all these other little questions. So if we teach students how to think, how to see the world, how the Bible is the filter through which they interact with the world, make decisions, how they behave, how they make choices, then all those little decisions that we're not going to be around for, we're not going to be there when they're freshmen in college at a public university and being challenged on these different things. But if we've taught them all along how to use the Bible as their set of lenses, then they can answer those little questions that come up when we're not there. And by little, I don't mean insignificant. Right. I mean, under the umbrella of worldview. Like, think of it as a worldview as a heading, and like all these questions as subpoints. That's what I mean as little. So I guess we kind of, at this point, probably should define specifically what we mean by worldview. And what kinds of questions fall underneath that. So, and if you're a parent listening too, I think this is hugely important for equipping your children too. Like, our daughter goes to a public school, and the way that they're going to steer her worldview for those 7 hours a day, we need to be very aware of the narrative going on in that classroom so that the worldview starts at home, teach her how to think, get her talking about what kids are doing, what kids are saying, what teachers are talking about, and all of that. And that's what our students are facing too. Yeah. They're in classrooms with non-Christian kids and non-Christian teachers where sin is not only normal, but very permissible. I think a lot of students don't understand things that, and we'll get into this in a minute, but things we take for granted, like, of course that's wrong, or of course, that doesn't line up with scripture, that kind of lifestyle. We cannot take that for granted anymore, that they know that.
Assumptions that,
I mean, my mind has been blown about things that students don't see any problem with, that is in direct contradiction to scripture. And it all comes back again, buzzword for the day, worldview,
right.
So, and without a consistent worldview, I mean, even you and I as adults, we're just as likely to be swept away in this current of whatever's going on in the culture, whatever people are saying.
Whatever is feeding it, whatever you're letting feed into yourself, whether it's news, social media, friendships, experiences in life, all that stuff shapes your worldview.
And the voices are loud and abundant, like the most, and we were talking about this, I think last night. I was listening to the Lisa Bevere podcast, I Am Adamant, and she was talking about how it's like we're in this world, we're swimming in opinions right now, and everybody has a platform, and so now deciphering through truth is harder than ever.
Multiple platforms too,
right? Whereas it used to be this many opinions, many outlets.
So many, exactly. Now there's, and one person can have 10 different outlets.
Right. And how does a student, I mean, you and I are adults, and it's hard to filter some of that stuff out of like, wait, is that true? Or like,
what random website did you get that from?
Exactly.
Just by simple,
And so imagine a student with very little life experience and a very limited worldview trying to navigate that. And they're on social media all the time. They're on YouTube all the time. They're hearing stuff all the time. And it's not even coming from the news. It's just coming from a meme or an influencer or a YouTube person who the stuff I hear and that I hear them repeat too. I'm like, oh my gosh. And they don't even know why. They don't even remember that kid who told you they were wearing camo because it was 9/11. He's like, we're wearing camo for 9/11. You're like, oh, like what's the significance of that? What did he say? What was his answer?
He said, I can't even remember. Oh, like, why are you wearing? Why are you wearing camouflage? Because it's 9/11. And I said, oh, is that a thing? Like, I thought maybe this is a new challenge or whatever. And he said, my friend and I are doing it. And so I thought, well, how is that? Why am I stupid for not knowing what you and your friend randomly decided to do?
So, okay, here are the big questions. So basically a worldview, doi, the way you see the world.
Doi?
Doi. I know. Even as I said it, I'm like, who says doi?
You do.
90s kid. Hey. So a worldview is basically it's a set of our most basic beliefs. It's the basis for how we make decisions and for our actions. And it's specifically these questions. Where did everything come from? And kids love talking about that question. I've gotten to do a lot of seminars on that recently, and they just eat that stuff up. They love talking about the origins of life. Who am I? What is right and wrong? And who decides? And that's that whole concept of relativism, which we're all very familiar with probably at this point. And then what happens when we die? And those are like the big questions. If we know how to answer those, forms this big outer shell of our worldview, and a lot of the other questions, like we said before, are buried within the answers to those questions. And so basically what we want students, and our goal is for them to understand that the Bible does hold the answers for these worldview big questions. Like, we don't just have to wonder, that there is truth with a capital T, and we have a source for it, and it never changes. Because students a lot of times, I think, get in their mind that we're very good at, as youth pastors and as parents, of teaching them that actions have consequences, right? They learn that at a very early age.
Right.
And so we get in the business unintentionally of behavior modification, which is great, to an extent, like for really young kids who don't understand morality quite yet, just getting them to understand, like, how to do the right thing. But then we have to have them understand the bigger picture. You could be compliant, but you're not a good person,
right.
And so we need to help them understand that this is beyond morality, just being a good person, like church, youth group, whatever. It's not the be good club. And I felt that way for a long time as a student. And as a kid, I just thought church is about being good, being nice, sharing, not saying bad words, like the end, and I didn't see how it impacted the bigger picture of my life. So we're very good at teaching kids actions have consequences, but we need to back one step back and say ideas have consequences. So getting them to think like bigger than their behavior. Well, where does your behavior come from? It comes from what's the saying? A man thinks, and so he is. We need to take it one step back, is that these ideas, that's the basis for your actions. It's not just actions leading to consequences. It's ideas leading to beliefs, leading to actions, leading to consequence. It's like, it's bigger than just what I do. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's a little Yoda-esque.
Thank you.
Fear leads to anger.
That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me. Also, a student asked the other day if I had a filter on, and I think that was one of the nicest things anyone has said to me.
You don't have a filter on your mouth most of the time.
Oh.
Hey-o!
Cheap shot. So, it's like, okay, well, these ideas, well, then what idea wins? If ideas have consequences, what idea is going to win? And that's, now we've hit the tension point, I think, because now let's go back to what we were talking about before. Students have ideas thrown at them constantly from people who seem very convincing, people who seem like experts, people who seem happy, people who seem to have it together. And
like you said, it goes back to adults can't even do that. And having all that experience, what's going to make a student be able to do that? Right. When these people, that is a very good point, that it's very convincing. The things that you are listening to, things that people are saying. Well, first of all, I always think, why would somebody lie?
Right.
But it's probably maybe they were
And
misinformed.
they're not. And exactly. That's what I was going to say. I don't think they're like, let's deceive the children.
Right. Maybe not
it's
consciously.
Truth to them.
Exactly.
But
if that's what they believed and they're saying it wholeheartedly,
right.
then you to take it in. Like, yeah, why would that not be the case?
Yeah, but if our students don't have those critical thinking skills, it's like, it's like that old illustration of the counterfeit bill. It's like you don't study the counterfeit, you study the real thing, so that when the counterfeit comes across, immediately you're like, something smells off.
Right.
And someone sent me this YouTube video recently about something, and just like the moment I started listening, I'm like, there's just something kind of fishy here, because when we confront ourselves with the truth constantly, the counterfeits are so easy to spot. So how do we get our students immersed in that truth, immersed in those critical thinking skills, immersed in, this truth-based worldview, because like I said before, we can't take for granted that they understand this. I mean, I've had students, things like living together before you're married. Mm-hmm. They're like, what in the world is wrong with that? And these are Christian kids.
Right.
The whole like...
A lot of them probably have parents that are doing that, not married.
Right.
But, living together.
Totally.
So why would they think anything different?
I've had students, to my shock and horror, that didn't even realize pornography was wrong. Mm-hmm. And I pushed them a little bit on that. Like, well, why... I said, I'm shocked that you're shocked that this is wrong. Let's talk about it. And their response to me, I'll never forget, was like, well, everybody looks at it. Like, it's everywhere. Like, I think because of the normality of it, it had lost its shock and like, oh, this is bad. It's just like, oh, there's another like account that's sketchy and we all look at it, whatever, haha, like no big deal.
Scary.
It is. And those voices are so loud. So there's this great illustration. It comes from 1 Chronicles 12:32. And it was the men of Issachar. And they were like the smallest tribe in Israel. And I love the way that the Bible describes them, because it says they understood the times and knew what to do. And so like this whole idea of like, they were not removed from the culture. They weren't like, let's do this holy huddle thing, get out of the culture, it's so bad. But the Bible says, no, they understood what was going on in the world around them. I've heard it described as like they had the newspaper in one hand, the Bible in the other. And because they had like the wherewithal to understand how those two intersected, that they became the leaders of Israel. I mean, they were the smallest tribe, but they had enough knowledge of the world around them and how things were going and how things were working, the events of the day, and how to combine the events of the day with God's truth. And that's always kind of blown me away, that their biblical knowledge now qualified them for leadership given the current state of affairs. So that does really pushes us to be a part of the bigger culture. And that's another thing we need to get students to understand, is how their faith is not compartmentalized, that we don't just like, okay, we're Christians and this is
in certain circumstances, we're Christian.
How it infiltrates into the bigger picture. No, you're a Christian in every sense of the word, and you're
at school, at church, at home.
The way you make decisions, the way you spend your money, the way you treat people, the integrity that you use in every situation, like getting them to really like use that faith muscle, that Christian muscle of like, I have to act based on my beliefs everywhere, not just at school, at church. And it cracks me up. Like, I had a kid drop, I don't know what word he said, some cuss word in the middle of church, and all the kids like freaked out. They were like, oh, you can't say that at church. And it wasn't like they were horrified that he said it, because they cuss constantly, but it was that he said it at church in front of the youth pastor. And I said, and they kept like looking at me like,
what's she gonna do?
Yeah, how's she gonna respond? And
fire and brimstone, here we go.
And I called them on that. I said, guys, I get the vibe you're more concerned about the location, he said, than like, hey, like,
what a great teachable moment.
I can do that sometimes,
So for those of you out there, have a staff member randomly curse and then use it to have the, the illustration of why are you upset that it was here and not everywhere?
Oh, how the turntables have turned. So here's some kind of, I guess, I don't know, sobering statistics. So these come from Sean McDowell. He says 29% of Christian teens do not believe in absolute truth, and 28 said they're unsure. Barna Research said only 9% of Christian teenagers believe in moral absolutes.
Only 9% believe in them? Is that what you said?
Yeah. And UCLA did a study showing that only half of Christian teens still consider themselves Christians by the time they are seniors in college.
That one's sad. Shocking.
Right.
They all are, but...
And I know a lot of people have a lot of theories probably as to why. But in light of what we're talking about today, I think we need to help students understand that what God wants to do is a lot deeper and a lot wider and a lot more intense in their life than just going to church and being a good person and then you go to heaven when you die. I think what we unintentionally have boiled it down to is some behavior modification, some good advice sometimes of like, hey, here's how to be a good friend, because we try to do things that are very applicable to their lives. But I guess now we're going to kind of get into the how to, because like here's a series on Worldview and we'll just hit them with it. Like we'll talk about intelligent design. We'll talk about the origin of life. We'll talk about morality. We'll talk about ideas. We'll talk about absolute truth. And sometimes it's just, I make it very black and white. Other times when it's like, all right, this is getting a little long. We've been talking about Worldview for 8 weeks now. We will move back into a series, but in the same way that like every single one of our sermons should draw a beeline to the gospel, we need to learn how to drip worldview and absolute truth and how to think into our sermons, even if they're not like specifically about worldview as the title, but a way to drip that in. So here's some questions that we want our students to be able to answer. And it'll take practice, but the more you look at worldview, and I'm going to give you some resources of where to go to find good materials on teaching and study and stuff like that. But we want our students to be able to answer the question, what about God? The big questions about God. Who is he? Does he exist? What is he like? If he does exist, these are big questions that they're going to hit at some point, and you won't be there when at 2 a.m. when they're laying in bed wondering this stuff, What is true and how do we know? We've hit that a little bit. Like we have to have them understand the concept of absolute truth, because right now students think that truth is fluid and that it depends on the situation.
Right.
And it depends on the person, What is human nature? That's answering that question of do we have a sin problem? And that's a big question to need to answer. I was listening to Craig Rochelle the other day, and he was saying for the most part, when he went to church as a kid, he just was like, he didn't even understand that what the problem of sin did for his relationship with God. Like they didn't understand the need for a savior. They need to understand the human condition,
right?
Not what we wish it was,
right.
What it actually is. What makes a healthy society? I think students, as they get older, especially, are really starting to ask those questions. A lot of social justice kinds of questions, and they want to know how God feels about social justice issues. What is the basis for law? Our kids are actually pretty interested in politics, and they hear a lot what their teachers are saying. Their parents are talking about politics in front of them. What is the purpose of government? They want to know and need to understand that. How do we use our resources, and what is the meaning of history? And those are like those big concept questions. So the worldview determines its what the current state of the world is like and how it should be. You know, we want students to be able to answer like, not only well, obviously we can see what's going on around it, but in a perfect world, what should these things look like? Like in their perfect state, what would be the ideal? If Jesus was here on earth, what would all these different things look like? So like we said, drip in those teachable moments. You know, even with your kids, the other day, my daughter, my 7-year-old and I were in the pool together, and we have this huge inflatable flamingo, and we were talking about it. We were using it for a game, and I just looked at it. I'm like, Annika, where did this flamingo come from? And she goes, what do you mean? I'm like, well, like, how did it get here? And
the good people of Walmart.
But she, something like that. She's like, we got it at the store. And I was like, yeah, but where did the store get it? And she goes, maybe a factory. I'm like, yeah. And then where'd the factory get it? She goes, I don't know. I'm like, well, they had to buy materials, or they had a designer, someone that, you know, gave them the measurements of how big the flamingo needs to be and what makes it safe or not safe. And then someone printed instructions. And she goes, yeah. And I said, so you can see this came from someone somewhere, some kind of design element, right? And she goes, yeah. I said, would you ever believe that this flamingo just existed and it just like all of a sudden got here and nobody knew? And she's like, no. And I was like, but did you know that's how some people view the world?
Right.
I'm like, it's just, they think it just happened. I'm like, isn't that silly? Like, the world's so much more complicated than this flamingo, but you can see there's instructions written in Japanese and Russian and French and in English and in Spanish, all on the side of this flamingo. Like, she's 7, but see, it was a teachable moment, and we have to grasp those with our students. So talk about what's going on in the world, the messages that are portrayed in movies and music and commercials on YouTube. What are those big cultural messages? And talk about them at church. Talk about them with your youth group. Kind of do some dissection on that. One of my favorite quotes is from George Lucas, and he says, I've always tried to be aware of what I say in my films, because for all of us who make motion pictures are teachers with very loud voices. And it's like, whoa, like he totally understood the influence that he has just by being a filmmaker of what messages he's putting out in the culture and what narrative he's writing for a society. And so we need to take those messages and talk about them, you know, with our students. And then another method could be role playing with students in terms of like, I'm a skeptic. Here's my questions, the problem of evil. Let's talk about it, and push back on them as if a college professor were pushing back on them, or a non-believer, or somebody who doesn't believe in absolute truth. Have these conversations, and they'll be bad at it, you know, at first, and especially if they're younger, but it's okay. It's a muscle we're trying to work to get them to understand. Like, you have to be able to be in the society. A great illustration is like, a fish doesn't know it's wet, right? Because it's always been in water. Our students don't know the crap that they're believing because it's all around them, and they don't differentiate between.
Can't see the difference.
They can't.
Yeah.
And so when we start pushing and asking and dissecting culture with them in the context of the Bible, just like the men of Issachar having the Bible in one hand and newspaper in the other, and saying, how do these fit together? How can we do this? We start to help them to understand your faith is like a set of glasses, a set of lenses through which you're going to navigate this world, little baby bird. And we're going to like say, okay, you're going to have to be a thinking Christian at some point, not just a church attender. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that is a big difference. We're creating thinking Christians who are going to impact the world, not simply church attenders, and not simply people who know how to behave, because that's not a disciple. Like, I would call that one of those lukewarm Christians that Jesus spits out of his mouth if it's all you can do is like be good and you don't know why, you know? Okay, so here's some where you can go for some resources. My absolute favorite at the moment is summit.org. Like, So they write curriculum specifically for private Christian schools. So when I was subbing at actually the private Christian school I went to growing up, I was a substitute teacher there. And on the Bible teacher's desk, I saw this amazing resource. It's called Light Bearers, and it's this whole curriculum. I bought the curriculum for my youth group, and it's for sure developed for teachers, but you can modify it to use within your youth group. It gets very academic, which is okay once in a while, because a lot of these kids go to public school and they're having zero Christian education except for whatever you teach them on Sunday. So make it kind of academic once in a while. I think they enjoy it. I've done even quizzes with them and stuff. There's a great book out by Sean McDowell right now, so the next generation will know. He takes this concept and runs with it. It's fantastic. Talks about worldview, and he gives so many great ideas for exercises to do with your students. Like he takes his students, like his high school students, to Berkeley and like makes them engage with these like non-Christian students, and like sometimes they get like shredded, but then they go back and talk about like, okay, like this is real, this is out there, this is how people think, like let's talk about it. And he says it's like his high schoolers' favorite things in the world. For some great resources on intelligent design, one of my personal favorite topics, the Creation Institute with Stephen Meyer. There's some great, super heady YouTube videos out there, but you take notes and filter it down for your students of hitting them where they're at. They don't need to know every single thing right away. There's the Apologetics Resource Center, American Vision, Christian Research Institute. So there's a lot of stuff out there, but for our purposes, I would say if you had to start anywhere, start at summit.org and see if you have it in the budget to purchase some of their curriculum. I actually went on a shoestring budget for a whole year so that at the end of the year I could splurge on the curriculum, and it was worth it because now I'll have it forever. I tried not to spend any of my budget so that I could do that, but I'm acting like it's thousands of dollars. I think it was like $300, but even so, big chunk of change for some of us. Yeah. And then that book, and that would be, you could have it tomorrow if you order it on Amazon Prime. So The Next Generation Will Know by Sean McDowell. So I think those will equip you to start thinking through a worldview lens, and in turn start teaching through a worldview lens, because it's, I think, important more now than ever that we start to teach Christian students how to think, not what to think, and that their faith is something bigger than behavior modification, but this impacts everything that they do.
And we'll have all those resources available in the YouTube description and in show notes. So thank you guys so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for checking out this episode. We hope that it provided a ton of insight for you to create health in yourself, your ministry, and your church.
And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to the Ministry Coach podcast wherever you're watching or listening. And it would mean so much to us if you would rate and review this show on Apple Podcasts.
And we'd also encourage you to share it with a friend so that it can go to help more people. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.